Alright guys, Noche UFC is over and that was one hell of an interesting card, wasn't it? Let's start straight away with the main event. I don't know if we'll get to all the fights in this video. Let's see how it goes. But that main event, number one, a awesome back and forth fight, okay? Straight up, that was a great fight to watch. It is a fight I'm going to be going back and watching, especially after the decision that we got. Personally, I thought Grasso was going to win this fight. I don't know if she did win this fight. I actually think a draw is the right decision to make, but when I saw the judges' scorecards at the end, how we got to the draw is insane to me, and some of the judging during this card is insane to me. It is one of the most controversial things in this sport is obviously the judges and how we actually get to these decisions. Now, that fifth round, how you can give that a 10-8 round to Grasso is ludicrous. That judge is a moron, Mike Bell. Mike Bell should be fired. That is crazy judging. How can you give that a 10-8 to Grasso? It doesn't make any sense. When we got to the draw, I was not surprised. I was sitting here with my brother, the filthy casual, watching it together, and we had our little, we were judging it as we were watching it, and we actually thought the third round was the 10-8 round. So when we heard the draw, we were not that surprised about it. But to get to the fifth round and to call that the 10-8 round, unbelievable. Actually unbelievable. That doesn't make any sense at all. That round was a 10-9 to Grasso at best. At best. She didn't really do that much damage on the ground or this is the thing, right? And I'm seeing the comments already on Twitter, in the chat rooms. I'm already seeing it that this is just rigged. And I mean, you know, with all the talk about Mexican Independence Day and how hard the UFC was pushing the Mexican fighters in this card, especially the decision for Shevchenko to throw the worst takedown you've ever seen in the last 2 minutes of the fight, in a round where she was winning the round that would have won her the fight, in the last 2 minutes to make that kind of decision, it sets off the sus radar. It sets off the sus radar just a little bit and makes you wonder, was she paid to take a dive at the end? I honestly find myself thinking that there's just too many coincidences there for her to make that sort of terrible decision making. Shevchenko, you were meant to be one of our most dominant champions. You're meant to be one of the best minds in the game at the moment, and you throw just a horrible takedown and then roll into submission attempts and don't even try and fight them off. It looked like in the last 2 minutes of that fight, Valentina Shevchenko was trying to lose the fight, which is what makes the mind think rigged. And the mind thinks rigged, but then the mind thinks back to last week, and we know that the UFC do not want Sean Strickland to be their champion. That is the last thing they want in the world. So how can you have something as important as Israel Adesanya, your game cover, biggest star champion? You know, how can you have something like that where he loses in the same rigged sport as Shevchenko taking a dive? Sorry to the Mexican fans out there, but what is the sales comparison? What are the numbers at the end of the year when it comes to who is champion more, Grasso or Israel Adesanya? You would assume that it's way more important to the UFC that Israel Adesanya is the champion. So if the UFC is a rigged organization, you'd think that's where they would be, paying people to take a dive, not Valentina Shevchenko. But then we have to ask ourselves, how the hell is Mike Bell giving that third round a 10-8 round to Grasso? That doesn't make any sense at all. The 10-8 round should have been the third round, and honestly, that round should have gone to Shevchenko. The third round should have gone to Shevchenko as a 10-8 round, and the last two rounds should have gone to Grasso as wins. Even though, Shevchenko was winning that last round until she wasn't, until she put it on herself. Just an unbelievable turn of events at Noche UFC, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Number one, who did you expect to win that fight going into that fight? And then as they were reading out the judges' scorecards, who did you think had actually won it? Who did you expect to win? Were you that surprised by the draw? I was not, but how we got there, incredible. Now, obviously, the UFC have set themselves up for an epic rematch. I wouldn't be surprised if that rematch did happen down in Mexico. The Mexican fan base have been pushing to have a live UFC event down there for ages, and now we seem to have the perfect scenario to have one down there, especially with the Performance Institute being opened up down there. I mean, overall, it was a great fight, but this is just one of those decisions and one of those fights that really like make you wonder, you know, now that we are partnered so closely with the WWE, is it time to jump ship on the UFC and just start to go and enjoy one championship in Southeast Asia? It is the better organization after all. Guys, let's move on to the co-main event. Kevin Holland versus Jack Della Maddalena. Going into this, I thought that Kevin Holland would win. I thought that he would do enough to win. And Jack Della Maddalena earned that victory, in my opinion. It was very impressive to see the way that Jack Della Maddalena handled the damage. Not every single time that Kevin Holland threw, but a lot of the times that Kevin Holland was throwing, he was just hitting the guard. He was hitting around Jack Della Maddalena. It looked like Kevin Holland was very much trying to open things up and create these shots to create movement and then see where he could counter. And there were times that Kevin Holland was doing that. But then on the return and at the start of all the entries, Jack Della Maddalena was just more crisp. When he was landing the harder shots. It would have been great for my picks to see Kevin Holland win, but I'm very happy with the way that that decision went. That seems to be the right decision. However, again, Judge Mike Bell, how you gave that first round to Kevin Holland. You did. You gave that first round to Kevin Holland. How is this guy still allowed to be a judge? Like, to me, that was clearly a Jack Della Maddalena round. He was landing the better shots, the more crisp shots. You could see in the face of Kevin Holland that he was out there having fun. He started to realize that JDM was the one putting the better shots on him, and then went and started to really focus up and try and win that fight. Mike Bell he might be the worst judge in MMA today. It was a horrible, horrible decision when I heard the scorecards get read out as a split decision. It was very clear that Jack Della Maddalena had just won every single round of that fight. I mean, maybe the second round could have gone either way. Maybe it's not very, very clear that he'd won every single round, but I mean, at best, Kevin Holland won the second round. That was about it. Kevin Holland, he lost. Now he's on a real skid. Now he's going to be really fighting for his place in the top 15, if he even stays in the top 15. And he really needs to start deciding whether he's there to entertain the fans or win fights, because he was fighting that fight with still one foot in the door of entertaining the fans. He was in there talking, popping shots from the outside, not really going for the kill, and JDM just sort of stayed locked in and focused. So if Kevin Holland is here to be a winner and be a competitor in the UFC, he really has to start focusing down. As for JDM, I think I want to see him in there again as soon as possible against Vicente Luque. You know, it's time for him to start really moving up the rankings. They're both coming off wins. I'd love to see him against Vicente Luque or against Ian Garry. I don't know if Ian Garry will take that fight, because Ian Garry is a bit of a delusional loser and doesn't want to fight down, but they're similar in the rankings. They're similar in their stages in the career. They're similar in their age. They're very similar fighters, and it's a sort of perfect UFC fight where it's like, all right, boys, now we see where you really are. Like, where do you two really stack up? So for me, it would be JDM versus Vicente Luque, or JDM versus Ian Garry. Either one I'd love to see, but they're the sort of fights that I want to start seeing for JDM moving forward. The next fight that I wanted to touch on, guys, was actually just Roman Kopylov. I'm loving what I'm seeing from Roman Kopylov at the moment. I'm a big fanboy. I am 100% on the Roman Kopylov bandwagon. He's a fellow, based Russian fanboy that I can get behind. I'm a big supporter of the Aussies and the Russians, and I think it's time to see Roman Kopylov get into the rankings. I want to see him against Chris Curtis. Chris Curtis has been looking shaky in his last couple of fights. I think he's 2 losses for 1 win in his last 3. He's got himself a number, but he needs to fight to stay in the rankings, which means he's got to take on an up-and-coming kid. I think that up-and-coming kid should be Roman Kopylov. I think that's an interesting match. And I think Kopylov can win that fight. I think Chris Curtis, he's got this mindset where if things aren't going his way, he starts to complain a bit and start whinging to the judges. He hasn't really got that fight in the fighter, and I think he needs to defend that a bit and actually prove that to us, the fans, and Kopylov is the perfect kid to do it. I'm officially a fanboy. I'm on the wagon. That's what I want to see for him next. The last thing that I wanted to cover, guys, on the card overall was the little bit of judging controversy that we had early in the card. Edgar Chairez versus Laceda. Now, as we were going through the fight, Chairez got Laceda into a choker hold, and the judge was there watching it. Now, in my eyes, I actually saw some taps from Laceda But when we actually went back and watched it slowly on the replay, it wasn't really a tap. It was more just like he was getting ready to tap. And as he was getting ready to tap, the referee started moving closer and closer in. Referee Chris Tognoni, he's moving closer and closer in, and he actually grabs Laceda's arm to see how he's going while he's in this choker hold. And his arm goes completely limp. And as his arm goes limp, Chris Tognoni calls the fight off, which, guys, he should do. Now, the moment that Tognoni calls the fight off, Laceda gets up and he starts protesting like, oh my God, I can't believe you did that. I was still in this fight. But just think about it for a moment. If Tognoni had grabbed his arm and watched the fighter go limp, and that fighter had actually gone limp, been unconscious, and continued to be in a choker hold for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, I know it's a lot of time in a fight, but even for 5 seconds, if he had allowed a fighter to go limp in front of him, even for 5 seconds, just imagine the reaction that would have been out on the internet, that would have been on Twitter, that the commentary booth would have had of what a disgusting stoppage that was, how he was putting that fighter's life at risk, that Chris Tognoni should be absolutely fired for doing that. The moment that you go limp in a choker hold, it is completely up to the referee to stop that fight. They have to stop that fight. What other choice do they have? You put Chris Tognoni in a lose-lose situation by pretty much turning into a soccer player and pretending to go to sleep so that the fight would get stopped. Because you knew that you were going out. You were going for the tap. You were thinking about tapping. And then Chris Tognoni grabs your hand to see if you're still in it. And you go, instead of doing this, you do this. And the fight stops and you're surprised by it. You shouldn't be surprised by it. You should be given the loss. If anything, you should be kicked out of the UFC for bringing that sort of soccer player shenanigans, faking injuries into it. Not faking injuries, but like just faking what is happening to get yourself a one-up on the competition. That is such a soccer player move. It's embarrassing to have in our sport. So for all the uproar, and then for Dominic Cruz to start yapping off at it as well, like Dominic Cruz, you are not a champion because you got beaten in the cage. You think you're not a champion because of bad refereeing. And there is bad refereeing. There's bad refereeing, there's bad judging. But Dominic Cruz carries that with him into every single fight that he commentates. And he cannot wait to start bringing it up. And he did that and just sort of led the charge against Chris Tognoni, where there is no way that Chris Tognoni could have made the right call in anyone's eyes. If a fighter is pretending to be asleep, Chris Tognoni has to get them out of there. And if a fighter does go to sleep, Chris Tognoni can't just stand there and watch an unconscious fighter in a choker hold. He's going to get absolutely demolished on social media for that. So I think that he made the right call. If you are going to pretend to be asleep, then suffer the consequences. You lose the fight. If anything, it is just disappointing that Edgar Chairez doesn't get his winning bonus because technically he won that fight, right? Whether or not the opponent actually fell asleep or pretended to go to sleep or pretended to go limp, you won that fight. Your opponent looked for a way out of the cage and they got their way out of the cage, and they should get out of the cage, and they shouldn't get their win bonus. No one should get their win bonus except for Edgar. Anyway, that's the last little thing that I wanted to cover on that fight. Again, guys, let me know down in the comments, do you think that Chris Tognoni made the right call, or do you think he should have let it go on and allow fighters to pass out in front of him? Do you think that's the right decision to make? Yes, that's a loaded question because it's bloody obvious what the right answer is to that. Guys, let me know down in the comments, how did you see the main event going? I know there's some controversy online about whether or not Kevin Holland actually won that fight. Do you honestly believe that? Convince me about it down in the comments if you do think Kevin Holland won that fight. If you guys have been enjoying these videos, if you've been enjoying the journey that we are on together as fans, maybe consider hitting the subscribe button down there, and I will see you all in the next one.